Noam Chomsky, if one were to judge by his books, is not one, but two people. There's Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics, probably the most famous expert in the world on the nature and structure of language, whose contributions to this esoteric science have not only been original, they've been revolutionary. And then there's Noam Chomsky, the polemicist and political philosopher, whose articles and books on American political policy in general, and the war in Vietnam in particular, have aroused intellectuals and given support to both the anti-war and draft resistance movements. Both Noam Chomskys are resident at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he's professor of modern languages and linguistics. Dr. Chomsky, what is the relationship between thought and language? You know, I vaguely have the idea that when I think and when I dream, I'm doing it in words. Does this mean that if a person didn't know a language, he couldn't think abstract thoughts?
Well, I don't want to pretend to give any expert answer to that, but on the basis of my own introspection, I'm sure I think in language, but I'm also sure I think in visual imagery and in other symbolic forms as well. I would think that clearly if you don't have a language, you can't express a very rich range of thought. And I assume that that contributes to thought.
Does that suggest that I think in words because the words are available? If they weren't available, there would be a thought process that went on in other kinds of symbols?
Well, I think, for example, you'd have no difficulty imagining a scene, let's say, and imagining something taking place in that scene, even without a verbal commentary.
But how would I deal with such things as truth and beauty and all the wonderful varieties?
Well, there certainly would be so sharp limits on the range of thought if language were not available, but I wouldn't go so far as to identify them.
What about the language in which a person does think? I suppose it's the language which is most natural to him. I asked one guest in what language he dreamed, and because he spoke 6 or 7 languages, and his answer was that it depended upon the character he was talking with. He used a language which was appropriate. Is language tied to, can one think more facilely in one language or another, for example?
Well, certainly it's difficult as an adult, let's say, to acquire another language so readily and with such facility that one can really think in it fluently and easily. There are rare individuals who can do this, but children, on the other hand, probably can master quite a number of languages and deal with them all essentially as native languages, think in them, dream in them, and so on.
Really almost be unconscious of what language they're using at any given moment, I suppose, internally?
I didn't grow up this way myself, but friends who've grown up in multilingual environments say that as very young children, they were even unaware that they were speaking different languages.
Really?
They knew that you spoke one language in the street and another language to your grandparents and another language to someone else, but they didn't really identify them as different languages, just different ways of speaking to different individuals.
So to a person who is not multilingual, and particularly one that didn't grow up in a multilingual family, it would almost seem that it would be more difficult to think in another language because of its structure than it would to think in this language, for example, whose structure seems to be easier to work with.
Well, unless you're lucky enough to be able to acquire a language in a natural setting, whatever that means exactly, it's extremely difficult to really internalize it, to make it really part of yourself in the way in which your native language is. And I suspect there's little doubt, in fact, that that's just a property of the human brain, that there's a way of developing a system which is really part of our thought and life, and there is another way of acquiring a system that remains at a certain distance from us. We can handle it intellectually, but
there is a barrier to, as you say, internalizing it easily.
There's a great barrier, and in fact it apparently gets much more severe probably after, I'd say, in adolescence or later than that. It's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to pick up a new language as really an integrated internalized language.
Does the nature or the structure of language tell us anything about how the human mind works?
I think it tells us a good deal. In fact, my own feeling is that's, for myself at least, that's the major interest in the study of language, is that I think this use of language is plainly a very distinctive human property, and one which, as you said...
It is distinctive. That is,
well, I think so.
the fact we can teach a bird to say words means nothing. And
well, you can teach. I think the most interesting work recently has been with chimpanzees, who've been taught extensive symbolic systems. As far as I can see, these are complicated associational systems, and I think very different from language in the way they function, in my opinion, though there's much controversy about this. And I think that by pursuing that kind of line of investigation, in fact, one may in fact discover in more precise detail what are those unique, I'm sure they are unique, properties of language that make it possible for a human child so readily to acquire this system of vast complexity and to use it.
It is vastly complex, then.
It's incredibly complex, and it does contribute immensely to the possibility of creative thought and expression in a way which is totally unique to human beings. And I think that by looking at the detailed structure of language, we have an almost incomparable way of gaining some insight into the specific nature of the human mind as a unique biological structure existing nowhere else as far as we know.
So what we discover will be transferable probably to other areas of learning beyond language?
Well, I think it's going to be very interesting to try to, in fact, there's a good deal of modern cognitive psychology, so-called, does try to use linguistic models in investigating other domains of intellectual competence. And that's, I think, a very fruitful and a rewarding path to follow. It's very difficult in other domains to gain such insight into the complexity of structure as in the case of language. Language is not only uniquely human, but it's also uniquely easy to study among the various kinds of intellectual achievements that a person develops. For example, you also have a very complicated theory of physical space that you've developed somehow, every human has, or a theory of human interaction, or a theory of personality, and so on. But we don't externalize these as we externalize our
language is
system.
there to be seen, measured, and everything
else. And therefore
else.
we have lots of possibilities of studying it, and through studying it, gaining, I think, considerable insight into the nature of mental capacities and cognitive structures and human intellectual achievements in general.
There are a good many people, specialists in the field, as you know, who believe that language is simply a matter of training, that a child can be trained to speak, and that there's nothing unique about this. You, I know, feel that there's something more than simply training. Why do you feel that there's something more to learning language than simply training?
Well, first of all, it's worth mentioning that most overwhelmingly people learn language without training. I mean, if you simply immerse a child in a situation in which language is spoken, he acquires this system.
But it's more than a response to the stimuli of the person around him speaking?
Well, the most obvious and sort of gross fact about language, which shows that, I think, is the innovative, creative character of it. I mean, every child is capable of understanding and producing very complex structures which have no simple relationship, no point-by-point relationship, no relationship on the basis of analogy, let's say, to the experience that he's presented.
The generative, creative structures of language.
Just that you can, as we're talking, we say new things, which we may not have said before. We hear new things.
I mean, language, as we talk, there's very little repetition in what we say?
Well, if you really were to see how little repetition there is, you can, let's say, take a book or a newspaper or a library, for that matter, and search for repetitions of phrases or sentences and so on. They occur, but rarely so. I mean, there are particular subparts of language, say greetings or conventional utterances of one sort or another, that do repeat frequently, but these are incidentally often marginal in their structure. For example, a sentence like "How do you do?" has a structure which is, in fact, unique. It's not the structure of any English sentence. And we don't create new sentences of that type. That's just a ritualized utterance.
Yeah.
But most of our linguistic interchange is, in fact, highly innovative. And of course, it's not just random. I mean, it's innovative, but somehow appropriate to situations.
It doesn't necessarily follow the rules that we were all taught in school of a subject and a predicate or a noun and a verb. I mean, I would have the impression that somehow in my schooling I was taught to do what it is that I do now.
Yeah, well, people have that impression, but the reason is that the actual rules of language, which certainly are not taught in school, because in fact nobody even knows them to this day, are totally unconscious. I mean, what you're taught in school is some relatively superficial set of generalizations about some of the products.
Are they important? Is it important to know that?
Oh, I think it'd be important to know it, but the point that has to be stressed is that first of all, that everyone knows, speaks a language very fluently and a very rich language before he ever goes to school. And furthermore, even if you wanted to teach somebody the rules of language, you wouldn't be able to do it because the rules are largely unknown. We're just barely beginning to discover them. It seems to us that there's no problem in speaking, just as it seems to us that there's no problem in, let's say, walking. But if we were to try to design an automaton, let's say, that would walk or ride a bicycle or identify a person. I mean, for example, you look at me from one point of view, and if I turn my face, you could still recognize me.
Yeah.
That's not so easy to do. I mean, we can do it because we have some special unknown capacities for perceptual identification. Well, in the case of language, too, we have this whole totally unconscious set of intricate mechanisms.
I mean, something's built into the system?
Well, I have no doubt that most of the richness of the structure of language is just a biological property of the organism. Can't be taught any more than you can be taught to have two arms and two legs.
You've got no way that you can X-ray it or
well,
put your finger on it.
At the moment, neurophysiology is not in a state where one can detect the physical structures that underlie linguistic use. I mean, only rather gross things are known. For example, it's known that language is controlled by the dominant. The brain has two hemispheres, and language is controlled by one dominant hemisphere. Incidentally, humans are, as far as I know, as far as anyone knows, the only organism that has lateralization, that has specialization of the two hemispheres. Apes don't, for example. And this is, as is well known, this is closely connected with language, and areas of the brain are known that have special relevance to various language functions. But when you get into the detailed, intricate structure of the system, it's still a mystery, entire mystery. One might say the same about learning. Nobody knows anything about the neurology of learning either, for that matter.
Now, one of the most controversial things that you've come up with is the fact that what you're saying is true not only of English, but true of all languages. There's a commonality that runs through all languages. I would have guessed that some languages were so rigidly structured that if you learned a set of 20 rules, it would take care of all situations.
Well, see, if what I just said before is true, that is, if a great deal of the structure of language is just a biological property that you bring to the learning situation, not something that you acquire in it, and if we further assume, as is unquestionably the case, that humans are not specifically adapted to learn one language or another, that is, there's no racial difference that makes it easier for you to learn this language or that language or something of that sort. From those two assumptions alone, it follows that all languages are going to be essentially uniform in that part of their structure which is biologically determined, just as there are only going to be certain possible limitations in the kind of gait that you can use when you walk. And you can't fly, no human being's going to fly. We're all going to walk. We may walk in slightly different ways, and these may be culturally determined in part, and so on. Well, I don't want to press the analogy too far. There's more differentiation in language than that. But still, I think that there is simply a biologically determined rich framework, which we can learn a lot about, incidentally. I think we can find out a good deal about it, and there are interesting theories about it that predispose us to acquire a system of great complexity of a very specific sort on the basis of a very slight familiarity, a very slight exposure to data. See, one of the most remarkable things about acquisition of language is that the child, or for that matter an adult, has had very few seconds in his lifetime, and the total range of data available to him is rather small as compared with his ability to express himself and to produce and understand sentences and utterances and discourses as he does in his normal life. And that again indicates that there's a rich biologically determined structure which therefore must be uniform across languages. Now, as far to get back to your original point, whether there are languages with a small number of rules that would suffice to explain everything, certainly nothing of that sort is known. I mean, insofar as languages have been carefully studied, living languages at least, they seem basically they do differ. And, I mean, one language is not another language, but they don't differ as far as we know.
There still is this creative aspect in all languages
well,
that is generative.
that's absolutely universal. That's just a human property, I mean, which is true of every language.
How did you become interested in linguistics? I know you grew up in Philadelphia. Your father was a Hebrew scholar, and it's been written about you that you proofread his book on medieval Hebrew grammar at the age of, what, 10, something like that? Mm-hmm. Did you have a kind of genetic fate that you were going to go into language as a result of that?
Well, I was undoubtedly influenced by my father's work in medieval Hebrew grammar, which I was extremely interested in and read his work and so on. It then lapsed for a while, and I actually came back to it in college from a totally different point of view.
Did you and your father talk a good deal about this? Was it a matter of family conversation, that the nature of languages?
Well, yeah. It was one of his, it's major scholarly interest of his, and I picked up a good deal about it.
So often a son tends to go in an opposite direction rather than the same direction.
Well, I don't know if one would really call this the same direction. I mean, my own interests in linguistics developed from a rather different point of view, and although there is convergence, and I suppose influence has to be, still it's a different, rather different area of linguistics. I mean, the kind of linguistics that I began to study in college had developed in virtual, in a totally separate intellectual tradition from the one in which I had in which I had this kind of informal background. It was very useful, incidentally, to have had that informal background in studying technical scientific linguistics later on. And I think the merger of the two was, for me at least, very useful.
I gather your interest in college grew out of an association with one of your professors who apparently persuaded you not to leave college, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, I was sort of planning to drop out of college, considering it an utter bore by about sophomore year, I guess.
Just not challenging enough?
Well, yeah, I found nothing interesting in it, really. And I took one course after another, and that killed my interest in one field after another. And I guess by the time I was a sophomore, I'd sort of had it. Until I met Zelig Harris, who turned out to be an outstanding linguist. I met him in a totally different context, had nothing to do with linguistics, but I liked him, was impressed with him. He was the first really intellectually interesting person I'd
Was the context in which you did meet him politics?
Yeah, radical politics.
Radical politics, which is your other interest, of course.
Which was a major interest of mine, in fact, the overwhelming interest at that stage of my life, and I met him in that connection. Actually, it had to do with left-wing, what was then called Zionist, I guess would now be called anti-Zionist activities that I was deeply involved in and that he was engaged in. And we had many, he was a very significant influence on my thinking in that area as well. But through that contact, I became gradually interested in the work he was doing and finally got back into it and ended up...
What was the source of your rather revolutionary theory, the one you've just been discussing, up to the point where you enunciated this theory? Linguistics was a somewhat different study, and when you did enunciate it, it caused a considerable furor. So it was certainly an original approach. Do you know what set you off on that from the more conventional studying of linguistics that you had done at college?
Well, it's, one can never be certain about that kind of thing. I mean, there were, I think in part it was due to the fact that I approached language at once from a point of view which was related to what I had, what I was more or less immersed in informally before I ever got to college. The kind of linguistics that I began to know about informally had to do largely with historical change and with efforts to explain the facts as they now exist on the basis of changes that had taken place through a sequence of historical stages. The linguistics that I was studying in college was very anti-explanatory. It was very descriptive. It was, in a sense, you might almost say, quasi-behavioristic. It was interested in...
This is what happened, but no explanation of why.
Well, it was an effort to give accurate, descriptive accounts of languages, and it was often done in a very sophisticated way. To me, that seemed inadequate, largely because I knew of how explanation would appear in a historical context, and I was encouraged to try to develop an explanatory theory, in part also by the fact that I was fortunate enough to be studying logic and mathematics and hence had some grasp of the kinds of formal systems that in fact were required to attempt to give an account of this ultimately of this creative ability.
I understand
Now, putting all these things together turned out to
that
be
you came to Harvard as junior fellow, and you did much of your work at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you did produce your first publications on this, that they weren't published.
Yeah, my first
the theories
book
simply
didn't
weren't
turn out,
accepted.
yeah. Well, in fact, the only really extensive work that I did on it, a long book, is, in fact, it's in press now, but it was finished in 1955, and it couldn't be published at that time. And it was turned down, in fact, by publishers, not unreasonably, actually. It was unrecognizable. Nobody could even tell what field it was in. And I was unknown, and it was. But what I did was, well, in fact, it was several. It was quite a few years, I think, before this work had much of an impact in the field, and that was largely, I think, because of some other linguists who became interested in it and began to work in it. A man named Robert Lees, in particular, or my colleague Morris Halley at MIT.
What you teach linguistics at MIT? What do you do to keep your students from falling into the same state of indifference that you did when you were in school?
Well, I don't know what to say about that. I mean, first of all, I have to do mostly with graduate students who tend to be very highly motivated. I do teach undergraduates, but I teach them in other domains. I teach an undergraduate course in social and political theory, and there I think many of the problems of how one relates to intellectual work and an academic commitment and scholarly commitments and so on do arise, and that's a very personal matter. I don't think there's any formula, nor would I ever try to persuade someone to follow a particular path. That's something one has to work out for himself, and there are many difficult problems.
You've said that your original association with Zelig Harris was in the area of radical politics. You are identified with the New Left, whatever that is. You certainly have been an activist as well as a writer in anti-war, anti-Vietnam War. And you've said that the course of history may be determined to a very significant degree by what the people of the United States will have learned from the catastrophe, meaning, of course, the Vietnam War. What, in your opinion, have we learned from this experience?
I would say very little, unfortunately. At the time I wrote that, which I guess was 7 or 8 years ago, what I had in mind was that there are really two different ways of looking at this catastrophe. One can look at it as a failed venture, a mistake, something which was...
It was a mistake because it failed.
Mistake because it failed, but perfectly all right if it succeeded. And I think it's probably fair to say that at least among intellectuals, people who write and speak publicly... That
You've been rather harsh on the intellectuals.
Yeah, I think they're totally unprincipled on this. I mean, I think the dominant view is that if we had gotten away with it, it would have been all right, but we couldn't get away with it, so therefore it was stupid, and therefore we should get out. You know, worse than a crime, it was a blunder or something of that sort. Now, if that's all that's learned from it, I think it'll have no effect on future history. It will have shown that there are limits to American imperialism.
And your opposition has been on moral grounds, that it was wrong from the outset, although you said your opposition came 15 years too late.
Well, active opposition came 15 years too late. I think the time for active opposition should have been about 1950 or a little later. But I didn't become really actively engaged in opposing the war until about 1964 or 65. And at that point, the United States was very deeply involved in what, if we were honest, we would call aggression against South Vietnam. That's in fact what it was. But I had, of course, always been opposed to the war. In fact, I was opposed to the Korean War, and it may surprise you, but I was even skeptical about the Second World War.
Are you a pacifist?
No, not a pacifist.
Are
in the
there
technical sense.
justifications for war under certain circumstances?
Yeah, I can see justifications for a defensive war. I could, putting it all together, I think there are justifications for a war against Nazi Germany in the 40s. But I felt, I was a high school student at the time, but felt then and have continued to feel, and in fact wrote about it in this book, that a good deal of the alleged justification for the war was totally beside the point, and that we were engaged in the war for reasons other than opposition to fascism or concern for people being sent to gas chambers and things of that kind. In fact, those motivations, I think, were virtually non-existent. Nevertheless, despite the hypocrisy, and there was plenty, I think that war could be justified. And I'm not a pacifist in the sense of someone who believes that it is in principle wrong ever and always to undertake violent acts. I think you have to have a strong reason for it, very strong. The burden of proof is certainly on a person who wants to undertake the use of means of violence, but I believe occasionally that burden can be met.
The way in which you describe the Vietnam War, particularly in your own words, is such that one would think that any good American, I use it in quotation marks, would totally reject the support of the Vietnam War. It's in your words, it stands for all that we're opposed to, oppression of other peoples and so forth. Now, either you would be wrong in your description, or there has to be a reason why the American would accept a war of this sort. Which is it? I guess you would never say it was a wrong description, of course. It's a stupid question from that point.
First of all, I'm not sure. See, we don't know what the population as a whole accepts or rejects because they're inarticulate largely. Among the people who are articulate, intellectuals, people who speak and write articles and so on, I think they've made it overwhelmingly clear that they consider the question of right or wrong irrelevant in the case of the United States. Of course, it's relevant if we're talking about some other country. For example, everyone would agree that it was wrong for the Russians to invade Czechoslovakia. That is, no one says, well, it was okay because they got away with it. But those criteria are never applied to ourselves, and that is totally unprincipled, though typical of other societies act this way as well. And it's that kind of lack of principle that I think has to be overcome, and the ideology behind it
being able to see ourselves as others see us, or as we see others, I suppose.
See ourselves by the principles that we occasionally enunciate. Apply those to ourselves. Yes.
I want to ask you in 30 seconds whether, if we do in fact by pursuing or expanding upon your studies, learn more about man's intelligence and how it functions, will that contribute to a better life?
It may contribute to a better understanding of what the essential needs of human beings are, and from that it's conceivable that someday we'll grow a concept of how a decent society ought to be organized, I think.
Thank you very much.